You know what scared them the most? It wasn't your anger. It wasn't your words. It wasn't even your success. It was the moment they realized you don't fear losing anything. They thought taking people away from you would break you. They thought betrayal would make you beg. They thought pain would make you surrender. But while they were busy threatening you with loss, you had already made peace with losing everything. And that's when the game changed. Because when a person no longer fears losing, they become impossible to control. Suddenly, the lies stopped. The manipulation stopped. The attacks became weaker. And one by one, they surrendered. Because nothing terrifies your enemies more than a soul that has nothing left to fear. Ha ha ha. They thought they were fighting someone who needed their approval, but they were standing in front of someone who had already survived their worst nightmare. And that's when they realized they had already lost. They always believed loss was the most powerful weapon a person could use against another human being. They counted on it. They trusted it. They built entire strategies around it. They understood that most people are terrified of losing something, losing relationships, losing opportunities, losing status, losing comfort, losing approval, losing the image they worked so hard to create. Fear of loss controls countless decisions every day, and people who understand that often use it to manipulate others without ever raising their voice. That's why they approached you the way they did. They assumed you were like everyone else. They assumed your fears were ordinary. They thought all they had to do was threaten something you valued, and you would become obedient. They believed pressure would make you compromise. They believed uncertainty would make you desperate. They expected you to panic the moment things became uncomfortable. They played their games carefully. Sometimes they used silence. Sometimes they used distance. Sometimes they made you feel replaceable. Sometimes they tried to convince you that everything good in your life depended on them. They wanted you to believe that your happiness existed only because they allowed it. They wanted you to think that if they walked away, everything would collapse. And for a while, maybe they thought they were winning, because fear is a strange thing. It makes people chase after what is already leaving. It makes people beg for respect from those who never intended to give it. Fear makes people settle for less, because they are terrified of ending up with nothing. Fear convinces people that loneliness is worse than betrayal. Fear whispers that losing something familiar is more painful than living with something toxic. They understood that fear, and they expected it to control you, so they created situations designed to weaken your confidence. They withdrew support when you needed it. They acted like your presence was optional. They made you question yourself. They expected insecurity to grow inside your mind. Every move was meant to remind you that they possessed something you couldn't afford to lose. But what they never understood was that people change when pain becomes familiar. Because suffering teaches lessons comfort never can. Every disappointment forced you to look inward. Every betrayal removed another illusion. Every setback stripped away another dependency. Piece by piece, life started showing you something they never expected you to discover. You survived losses before. You survived nights nobody knew about. You survived disappointments nobody apologized for. You survived watching things disappear that you once thought would last forever. And somehow, despite everything, you were still standing. That realization changes a person, because once someone understands they have survived their worst moments, threats stop looking powerful. When you've already faced heartbreak, the fear of heartbreak becomes smaller. When you've already experienced rejection, rejection loses some of its ability to intimidate. When you've already walked through loneliness, loneliness stops feeling like a monster. What once looked terrifying begins to look familiar, and familiar pain no longer controls you. But they couldn't see that. They still believed they had leverage. They still thought they could create enough pressure to make you surrender your values. They expected you to abandon your principles, to protect temporary comfort. They thought you would sacrifice your dignity just to avoid losing people who never truly valued you. Because that's what fear usually does. Fear makes people negotiate with disrespect. Fear convinces people to tolerate dishonesty. Fear teaches people to stay where they are unwanted, simply because they are afraid of what happens next. And they expected that same fear to keep you trapped. They expected you to chase. They expected you to explain yourself endlessly. They expected you to beg for understanding. They expected desperation. But every attempt revealed something unexpected. You weren't reacting the way they predicted. Their silence didn't destroy you. Their distance didn't break you. Their threats didn't shake you. Their attempts to create uncertainty didn't create panic. Because the weapon they trusted so much was slowly losing its power, and they couldn't understand why. What confused them the most was seeing someone remain calm while things were being taken away. They expected chaos. They expected emotional collapse. They expected you to fight desperately, to hold on to everything. Instead, they saw patience. They saw acceptance. They saw someone who understood that nothing in this world is guaranteed. People change. Situations change. Doors close. Seasons end. Nothing stays forever. And once a person accepts that truth, fear begins to lose its grip. Because loss only controls those who believe they cannot survive without what they've afraid of losing. That was the foundation of their strategy, and they never imagined that foundation was already beginning to crack. Before the fear disappeared, the pain arrived first. Nobody becomes fearless because life was easy. Nobody develops unshakable strength because everything worked out perfectly. Fearless people are not created by comfort. They are created by disappointment, heartbreak, betrayal, loneliness, and moments that force them to face realities they never wanted to accept. There was a time when pain felt unbearable. There was a time when every setback seemed personal. Every rejection felt like proof that something was wrong with you. Every betrayal left questions inside your mind. You wanted answers. You wanted fairness. You wanted people to explain why they changed, why they lied, why they disappeared, why they treated loyalty like it meant nothing. But life rarely gives explanations. Sometimes people leave without warning. Sometimes promises mean nothing. Sometimes trust is broken by the very people who once claimed they would never hurt you. And when those moments happen, pain enters quietly. At first, you fight it. You tell yourself things will go back to the way they were. You hold on to memories. You replay conversations. You search for signs that maybe things can be repaired. You convince yourself that if you just try harder, love harder, sacrifice more, somehow everything will return to normal. But pain has a way of exposing illusions. It reveals who was pretending. It reveals who only stayed when it was convenient. It reveals who loved conditions more than loyalty. And every truth hurts. Because the hardest wounds are not created by strangers. They are created by expectations. They are created by trust. They are created by believing someone would never become the reason for your suffering. Pain changes the way you see people. Suddenly, words become less impressive. Promises become less convincing. You begin paying attention to actions instead of speeches. You stop being impressed by appearances. You stop chasing approval. You stop expecting everyone to understand you. Because pain teaches you something comfort never teaches. People can change. Situations can change. And sometimes the things you trusted most are temporary. Those realizations hurt. But hidden inside that hurt is transformation. Because every painful experience forces you to become stronger or become bitter. And strength doesn't arrive all at once. It happens slowly. You become stronger after surviving sleepless nights. You become stronger after learning to smile while carrying burdens nobody understands. You become stronger after discovering that healing is often lonely. You become stronger after realizing that nobody is coming to rescue you. And with every difficult season, something inside you starts changing. You begin depending less on others. You stop building your happiness around people's opinions. You stop giving strangers control over your peace. You stop allowing rejection to define your worth. Not because you became cold, not because you stopped caring, but because pain taught you that depending on temporary things creates permanent suffering. The lessons were expensive. Every betrayal cost something. Every disappointment left scars. Every silent battle demanded patience. But slowly, the fear that once controlled you started becoming weaker. Because after experiencing enough pain, certain fears no longer seem powerful. You stop fearing rejection because you've already survived it. You stop fearing loneliness because you've already walked through it. You stop fearing abandonment because you discovered that losing others doesn't mean losing yourself. You stop fearing failure because you've already faced moments that felt worse than failure. And something strange begins to happen. The same situations that once created panic now create clarity. The same challenges that once broke your spirit now strengthen your focus. The same people who once had the power to hurt you begin losing that power because pain teaches you endurance, and endurance changes everything. People who have never suffered often panic when life becomes difficult, but those who have faced darkness understand something others don't. They understand that pain doesn't last forever. They understand that emotions change. They understand that storms pass. They understand that healing takes time. And because of that understanding, fear starts losing its authority. Not because life becomes easier, but because your mind becomes stronger. You stop needing certainty all the time. You stop needing guarantees. You stop expecting perfect outcomes. You accept that life contains disappointment. You accept that losses are unavoidable. You accept that change is part of existence. And acceptance creates peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from having everything, but the kind that comes from knowing you can survive even when things fall apart. That realization scares people who depend on controlling others, because control works through fear, and fear works through attachment. But pain had already forced you to confront the possibility of losing everything you thought you needed. And somehow, despite the heartbreak, despite the setbacks, despite the disappointments, despite the nights when nobody understood your struggles, despite the moments when hope seemed distant, despite every wound life placed in your path, you continued moving forward, not perfectly, not without scars, not without memories, but with a strength that only suffering could create, a strength built quietly, a strength nobody noticed while you were fighting battles inside your own mind, a strength born from tears nobody saw, a strength shaped by moments when giving up felt easier than continuing, a strength forged in silence while the world assumed you were falling apart, because pain has a strange way of transforming people, and sometimes the very things meant to destroy you become the reason you no longer fear what once controlled you. Control has always depended on one thing more than anything else: fear, not strength, not intelligence, not power, fear, because when people are afraid, they become easier to influence. Fear makes people compromise their values. Fear makes people tolerate disrespect. Fear convinces people to stay silent when they should speak, and chase after things that are already slipping away. Those who understand this spend their lives using fear as leverage. They know that if they can make someone afraid enough, they can shape their decisions without ever needing force. That is why control often hides behind emotional games. Sometimes it appears through approval, sometimes through guilt, sometimes through silence, sometimes through rejection, and sometimes through the threat of loss. The methods change, but the goal remains the same. Make the other person afraid. Make them question themselves. Make them believe that their happiness depends on your permission. Make them think they cannot survive without what you provide. Because fear creates dependence, and dependence creates control. That's why so many people remain trapped in situations they secretly hate. They fear being alone. They fear starting over. They fear disappointing others. They fear losing comfort. They fear uncertainty. And because of that fear, they sacrifice peace in exchange for familiarity. People stay in relationships that destroy their confidence because they fear loneliness. People remain silent in places that disrespect them because they fear rejection. People hide who they truly are because they fear judgment. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It whispers that it's safer to stay where you are. It whispers that risking change is dangerous. It whispers that acceptance is more important than self-respect. And for a long time, maybe those whispers affected you too, because everyone experiences fear. Everyone wonders what will happen if things fall apart. Everyone questions themselves during difficult seasons. Everyone has moments where uncertainty feels overwhelming. But life has a strange way of changing people. Pain changes people. Loss changes people. Disappointment changes people. And after enough storms, something begins to happen. The fears that once controlled your decisions start losing their power, not because you suddenly become fearless, but because experience teaches you something important. You realize you've survived things you once thought would destroy you. You survived betrayal. You survived rejection. You survived loneliness. You survived heartbreak. You survived moments when nobody understood your struggles. And every time you survived, fear became weaker, because fear thrives on imagination. It convinces people that disaster is unbearable. But experience teaches something different. Experience teaches that suffering can be endured. Experience teaches that pain eventually passes. Experience teaches that starting over isn't death. And when those lessons become real, control starts falling apart. Because control requires emotional dependency. It requires panic. It requires desperation. It requires someone who believes they have no choice. But once you understand that your peace doesn't depend on another person's approval, something changes inside you. You stop chasing people who enjoy being chased. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop negotiating with disrespect. You stop sacrificing your dignity for temporary comfort. Not because you became arrogant, not because you stopped caring, but because your self-respect became stronger than your fear. And people notice that. The same individuals who once expected emotional reactions become confused by your calmness. The same people who relied on guilt become frustrated when guilt no longer works. The same people who used silence as punishment become uncomfortable when silence no longer scares you, because their power was never based on truth. It was based on your fear. And when fear disappears, their influence begins disappearing with it. That's why some people become angry when they lose control. Not because they lost love, not because they lost connection, but because they lost access. They lost the ability to manipulate your emotions. They lost the ability to predict your reactions. They lost the confidence that they could make you doubt yourself. And suddenly, the person they once thought was easy to influence becomes impossible to understand. Because peace creates unpredictability. A person who no longer fears being abandoned cannot be controlled by threats. A person who no longer fears loneliness cannot be manipulated by distance. A person who no longer fears rejection cannot be silenced by criticism. And a person who no longer fears starting over becomes dangerous to anyone who relies on control. Because such people don't act from desperation. They act from conviction. They don't stay because they're afraid to leave. They stay because they choose to. And choice is something control cannot dominate. That's what frightened them. Not your anger, not your words, not your success, but your independence. Because independence destroys manipulation. It destroys emotional chains. It destroys the illusion that somebody else owns your peace. And suddenly, the things that once looked powerful start appearing weak. The threats become meaningless. The games become obvious. The pressure becomes ineffective. Because fear had always been the lock. And the moment fear disappeared, the door they once kept closed no longer required permission to open. The same walls designed to keep you trapped started becoming invisible. The same voices that once made you doubt yourself started sounding smaller. The same tactics that once caused anxiety started losing their ability to shake your spirit. Because control can only survive where fear is welcomed. And the day fear lost its place inside you, the foundations they depended on began collapsing piece by piece. They never imagined surrender would become inevitable. In their minds, they believed they had all the advantages. They believed they understood people. They believed they knew how pressure worked. They trusted the same patterns they had used before, because those patterns had always produced results. Fear had always given them influence. Manipulation had always given them leverage. Silence had always created panic. Distance had always made people chase. They had grown comfortable believing that everyone eventually broke. That's why they approached you with confidence. Not because they were stronger, not because they were wiser, but because they assumed you would react like everyone else. They expected desperation. They expected emotional chaos. They expected endless explanations. They expected you to fight for their attention. They expected you to sacrifice your dignity to avoid losing what they offered, because that had always worked before. And in the beginning, maybe they saw signs that convinced them they were right. Maybe they saw your kindness and mistook it for weakness. Maybe they saw your patience and assumed you lacked strength. Maybe they saw your loyalty and believed they could take it for granted. People often misunderstand good hearts. They mistake compassion for dependency. They mistake understanding for surrender. They mistake patience for powerlessness. And because of that misunderstanding, they become careless. They believe they can push forever without consequences. They believe loyalty has no limits. They believe kindness will always remain available. They believe forgiveness means endless tolerance. But every person has a point where clarity replaces confusion, and that point changes everything. Because once you stop seeking approval, the entire game changes. Once you stop trying to convince people of your value, the pressure disappears. Once you stop fearing loss, manipulation begins losing its purpose. And that's when they started noticing something strange. You were no longer reacting the way they expected. You weren't arguing endlessly. You weren't begging for understanding. You weren't trying to force people to stay. You weren't chasing explanations. Instead, you became quieter. Not because you gave up, but because you understood something important. Not every battle deserves your energy. Not every misunderstanding deserves your defense. Not every departure deserves resistance. And that calmness confused them. Because people who rely on control expect emotions. They expect panic. They expect desperation. They expect tears. They expect fear. But peace gives them nothing to work with, and without emotional reactions, their strategies begin failing. The silence they once used to create anxiety stopped producing results. The distance they used to create insecurity stopped creating fear. The games they relied on started feeling meaningless, because they were trying to control someone who no longer depended on their approval. And dependence had always been their greatest weapon. Without dependence, they had nothing. Without fear, they had no leverage. Without desperation, they had no advantage. And slowly, they started realizing it. Not all at once, but through moments. They noticed you stopped chasing. They noticed you stopped explaining yourself. They noticed you stopped trying to prove your worth. They noticed you were investing your energy elsewhere, growing, healing, learning, moving forward. And what frightened them wasn't your anger. It was your peace. Because peace sends a message words never can. It says you have accepted reality. It says you have stopped negotiating with disrespect. It says you understand your value. It says you know life continues, with or without anyone's permission. And people who expected control struggle to understand that kind of confidence. Because confidence removes uncertainty. Confidence removes dependence. Confidence removes emotional chains. And when emotional chains disappear, power shifts. Suddenly, the person who once believed they controlled everything begins questioning themselves. They wonder why their methods stopped working. They wonder why their absence no longer creates panic. They wonder why their opinions no longer carry the same weight. They wonder why the person they once influenced now appears untouchable. And slowly, frustration replaces confidence. Because losing control creates discomfort. Especially for people who built their identity around controlling others. They begin increasing pressure. They try old tactics again. They repeat familiar patterns. They search for reactions. But every failed attempt reminds them of something they never expected to face. Resistance. Not loud resistance. Not angry resistance. But quiet resistance. The kind that comes from self-respect. The kind that comes from experience. The kind that comes from a person who has already survived enough pain to understand that peace is worth protecting. And eventually, reality becomes impossible to ignore, because no strategy lasts forever. No manipulation lasts forever. No illusion survives forever. And people who depend on control eventually face the same truth everyone faces. They cannot force loyalty. They cannot manufacture respect. They cannot own another person's peace. They cannot demand genuine connection, and they cannot win against someone who has already made peace with losing everything they once and feared. That's when the confidence disappears. That's when the games become exhausting. That's when the pressure loses meaning. That's when the endless attempts start feeling useless. Because surrender isn't always announced. Sometimes surrender appears in silence. Sometimes surrender appears when people stop trying to control what they no longer understand. Sometimes surrender appears when they realize the person standing in front of them no longer fears walking away. And in that moment, they understand something that pride prevented them from seeing. They were never fighting weakness. They were fighting someone who had already learned how to survive, without everything they used, as weapons. And that realization slowly forced them to accept a truth they spent so long trying to avoid. There was nothing left they could threaten, nothing left they could take, nothing left they could use against you.